The gunshot that rang out across the town square of Dalhart, Texas, wasn't what drew Nora Vaughn's attention that sweltering afternoon in August of 1882, but rather the auctioneer's booming voice announcing that the next item up for bid was a living, breathing cowboy. She had come to town with her meager savings sewn into the lining of her worn traveling bag, hoping to purchase a decent horse or perhaps some farming equipment to help her manage the small homestead she had inherited from her late uncle 3 months prior. Instead, she found herself staring at a makeshift stage where a tall, sun-bronzed man stood with his hat in his hands, his dark eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, as though he could will himself to be anywhere else in the world. The auctioneer, a portly man with sweat staining his collar, gestured dramatically toward the cowboy. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is Reed Donnelly, finest ranch hand this side of the Panhandle. Got himself into a spot of trouble with gambling debts to Mr. Hutchinson over at the Silver Spur, and the good gentleman has agreed to settle the matter through this here auction. Whoever wins gets Reed's services for 1 full year, contract signed and legal. He can rope, ride, break horses, mend fences, and do just about anything else you might need on a spread." Nora felt her heart clench with an emotion she couldn't quite name as she watched Reed's jaw tighten. There was something deeply wrong about this, something that made her stomach turn, but she also recognized the hard reality of frontier justice. Men settled their debts however they could out here, and sometimes that meant selling their labor in ways that stripped them of dignity. She had seen enough of life's cruelties in her 22 years to know that idealism rarely survived contact with necessity. "We'll start the bidding at $5, the auctioneer announced, and a ripple of interest moved through the crowd. Several ranchers called out bids, their voices gruff and businesslike. Nora watched Reed's expression remain carefully neutral even as the price climbed to $8, then $9. She noticed the way his hands gripped his hat, knuckles white with tension, and something in her chest cracked open. She had $12 to her name. $12 that were supposed to keep her fed through winter, supposed to buy seed for spring planting, supposed to be the thin line between survival and destitution. But as she looked at Reed Donnelly standing there like a horse being evaluated for purchase, she thought about how her uncle had taken her in when her own family had turned her away after her father's death left them penniless. She thought about kindness, about human dignity, about all the small choices that separated people from animals. $12, she heard herself say, her voice carrying clear and steady across the square. The crowd turned to look at her, and she felt their eyes assessing her threadbare dress, her sun-darkened skin, her work-roughened hands. She lifted her chin and met their stares without flinching. On the stage, Reed's dark eyes found hers for the first time, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. The auctioneer waited, scanning the crowd for any higher offers. The ranchers who had been bidding muttered among themselves but didn't raise their hands. $12 for a year's labor was more than fair, and none of them were willing to go higher for a man whose gambling suggested unreliability. "Sold to the young lady for $12, the auctioneer finally declared, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Come on up and settle your account, miss." Nora's legs felt unsteady as she made her way through the crowd, very aware of the whispers following her. She had just bought a man's labor for a year. The wrongness of it sat heavy in her throat, but she forced herself to keep moving forward. When she reached the stage, she carefully counted out her $12 into the auctioneer's palm, each coin feeling like she was paying for her own folly. Reed descended from the stage, and up close she could see he was probably 25 or 26, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against his tanned skin. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and there was something in his expression that was part wariness, part curiosity, and part resignation. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel, "I reckon we should discuss the terms of my employment." "Not here," Nora replied, equally quiet. She was acutely aware of the crowd still watching them, hungry for scandal or entertainment. "I have a wagon at the edge of town. We can talk there." She turned and walked away without checking to see if he followed, trusting that he would. The contract was legal and binding, after all, even if every fiber of her being rebelled against the concept. Her wagon was a rickety affair that had come with the homestead, pulled by a single aging mare named Bess. She climbed onto the driver's seat and waited until Reed settled beside her, his long legs making the space feel cramped. "I have a homestead about 5 miles north of here," Nora began, gathering the reins in her hands. 40 acres, most of it suitable for crops or grazing. There's a cabin, a barn that needs significant repairs, and a well that runs clean. I inherited it from my uncle Samuel Vaughn 3 months ago. He died of fever last May. "I heard about Sam Vaughn," Reed said, and there was genuine sorrow in his voice. "He was a good man. Helped me out once when I was green and stupid, fresh off a trail drive and about to get myself killed in a bar fight. Talked sense into me instead." Nora felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. She hadn't known many people who had kind words about her uncle, who had mostly kept to himself in his final years. "He was a good man," she agreed softly. "He was the only family member who didn't turn his back on me when things got hard." Reed was quiet for a moment, and Nora guided Bess through the streets of Dalhart, past the false-fronted buildings and the saloons already doing brisk business, even though the sun hadn't set. Once they were clear of town, following the dusty road that led north across the flat Texas panhandle, Reed spoke again. "Miss Vaughn, I need to be straight with you. The gambling debt was real, and it was my own damn foolishness that put me in that position. But I'm not a bad worker when I'm sober and focused. I can do everything that auctioneer claimed and more. I'll honor this contract for the full year, and I'll give you honest labor. But after that, I'll be moving on. I don't aim to put down roots anywhere." Nora nodded, keeping her eyes on the road ahead. "I understand, and I need to be straight with you as well. I paid $12 I couldn't afford to spend because watching you stand up there made me sick. No person should be bought and sold like livestock, debt or no debt. But the reality is that I do need help with the homestead, and I can't pay you wages beyond room and board. So I'll accept your labor for the year, and I'll provide you with decent food, a place to sleep in the barn once I get it properly fixed up, and fair treatment. But don't expect anything beyond that." "Fair enough," Reed said, and some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. "Can I ask why you're out here alone? Seems unusual for a young woman to be working a homestead without family." The question was personal, but Nora supposed they would be living in close quarters for the next year, so there was no point in maintaining strict privacy. "My father was a merchant in Kansas City. When he died 5 years ago, he left nothing but debts. My mother remarried quickly to a man who made it clear I wasn't welcome. I worked as a seamstress for a while, then as a cook in a boarding house, but the pay was poor and the conditions were worse. When Uncle Samuel's lawyer contacted me about the inheritance, it seemed like a miracle. A chance to build something of my own, to have a piece of land that nobody could take away from me." "That's a hard road for a woman alone," Reed observed, but there was no judgment in his tone, only acknowledgement of reality. "It's a hard road for anyone," Nora countered. "But I'd rather break my back working my own land than break my spirit working for someone else." Reed made a sound that might have been agreement or simply thoughtful consideration. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking and swaying over the rutted road. The August heat was fierce, the sun beating down on them without mercy, and Nora was grateful when she finally spotted the cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the boundary of her property. The homestead looked even more ramshackle than she remembered, and she felt a flush of embarrassment as Reed took in the sagging barn roof, the cabin with its gaps that needed chinking, and the fields that had gone to weeds in the months since her uncle's death. She had been working desperately to get the cabin livable and the garden planted, but there was so much work that needed doing and only her 2 hands to do it. "It needs work," she said defensively as she pulled Bess to a stop near the cabin. "It needs work," Reed agreed, climbing down from the wagon. "But the bones are good. That barn can be saved and the cabin's solid enough. The well being clean is the most important thing. I've seen worse spreads turn into profitable operations." Nora climbed down as well, her muscles aching from the long day. "There's stew left from yesterday in the cabin. It's not much, but you're welcome to it. I haven't had time to work on the barn sleeping quarters yet, so for tonight you can bed down in the barn as it is. Tomorrow we can start making a proper plan for the work that needs doing." Reed nodded, setting his small pack down. He had been auctioned off with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever he had been carrying. "I appreciate the food, and Miss Vaughn. Thank you for not treating this like you actually own me. Some folks would have." Nora met his eyes squarely. "I don't own you, Mr. Donnelly. I own your labor for a year, and that's all. Don't forget the distinction, and neither will I." Something shifted in Reed's expression, a wariness giving way to something that might have been respect. "Yes, madam," he said quietly. That first night, Nora lay in her narrow bed in the cabin, listening to the sounds of the prairie through the gaps in the walls, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. $12 gone, and a strange man sleeping in her barn. But when she thought about Reed's face on that auction block, she couldn't bring herself to regret it entirely. She had done something, at least. Whether it was something foolish or something brave remained to be seen. The next morning dawned hot and clear, and Nora was up with the sun as always. She made coffee and cornbread, then went out to the well to draw water. She found Reed already awake, examining the barn's roof with a critical eye. He had rolled up his sleeves, and she could see the corded muscle in his forearms, the evidence of years of hard physical labor. "Morning," she called out, and he turned, nodding in greeting. "Morning, Miss Vaughn. I've been looking over what needs doing. That roof is the most urgent task, I'd say. If we get rain, everything in the barn will be ruined and Bess there needs proper shelter. After that, we should work on expanding the garden and getting some crops in the ground. It's late in the season, but we might still manage turnips, carrots, and some greens." Nora felt a surge of relief that he was taking initiative rather than waiting for her to direct every task. "I have some lumber stored behind the cabin. Uncle Samuel had bought it before he got sick, planning to make those very repairs. And I agree about the garden. I've been working on it when I can, but there's only so much I can do alone." They fell into a routine over the following days. Reed proved to be as skilled as advertised, working from sunup to sundown with a focus that impressed Nora. He repaired the barn roof, reinforced the walls, and built a proper sleeping area for himself in the barn's loft. He fixed the fence around the garden plot and helped Nora plant late-season vegetables. In the evenings, they would eat together, simple meals of beans and cornbread, salt pork and potatoes, whatever Nora could manage with her limited supplies. At first, their conversations were stilted and formal, but gradually they began to relax around each other. Reed told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, how he had taken to cowboy life naturally, but had a restless spirit that kept him moving from place to place. Nora told him about her childhood in Kansas City, about her father's kindness and her mother's coldness, about the dreams she had harbored of a different life. "I used to think I'd marry well," she admitted one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Find some merchant or banker who could give me a comfortable life. Foolish dreams for a girl with no dowry and no prospects." Reed was quiet for a moment, whittling a piece of wood into something that was starting to look like a small horse. "Don't seem foolish to want security. That's just human nature." "But it was foolish to think it would come through marriage," Nora said. "I'm better off building my own security. At least then I know it's real." "You're braver than most," Reed observed, his knife moving steadily. "Most women in your position would have looked for a husband to take over the homestead." Nora laughed, but there was little humor in it. "I'm not pretty enough or charming enough to attract that kind of help, and I have too much pride to pretend otherwise." Reed looked up from his whittling, his dark eyes serious. "You're wrong about that, Miss Vaughn. You're plenty pretty, and you've got more courage and capability than most men I know. Any man would be lucky to stand beside you." The words hung in the air between them, and Nora felt her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to compliments, especially not sincere ones. "That's kind of you to say, Mr. Donnelly, but I know my own worth in the marriage market. It's not much." Reed returned his attention to his whittling, but she thought she saw a tightness around his mouth. "The marriage market's a fool's game anyway. People should choose each other because they want to, not because they need to." "That's a luxury most people can't afford," Nora pointed out, but she thought about his words later, lying in her bed. The idea of choosing someone out of want rather than need seemed impossibly romantic, something from the dime novels she had occasionally read when she could get her hands on them. As summer gave way to early autumn, the homestead began to transform. The barn stood sturdy and weatherproof. The garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented their diet. Reed built new shelves in the cabin, repaired the door so it hung straight, and chinked the gaps in the walls so that the interior stayed warmer. He was unfailingly respectful, always calling her Miss Vaughn, always maintaining proper distance. But Nora found herself increasingly aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with his labor. She noticed the way his hair curled when it was damp with sweat, the rare smile that transformed his usually serious face, the gentleness with which he handled Bess, or the barn cat that had shown up one day and decided to stay. She noticed the sound of his voice in the morning, rough from sleep, and the way his hands moved with confident precision whether he was mending a fence or carving wood. She told herself firmly that these observations were foolish and dangerous. Reed had made it clear he would be moving on after his year was up. He was working off a debt, nothing more. Any feelings she might be developing were entirely one-sided and entirely unwelcome. One afternoon in late September, a group of riders approached the homestead. Nora was working in the garden when she heard the thunder of hooves and looked up to see 5 men on horseback, all armed. Her heart began to pound as she straightened, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. Reed emerged from the barn, his hand resting casually on his belt near where she knew he kept a knife. The leader of the group was a man she recognized from town, a rancher named Henry Blackwell who owned a large spread to the east. He was in his 40s, with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes that reminded Nora of winter ice. "Miss Vaughn," Blackwell said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. I heard you were out here trying to work Sam Vaughn's old place. Thought I'd ride over and see how you were managing." "I'm managing fine, Mr. Blackwell," Nora said, keeping her voice steady. "Was there something you needed?" Blackwell's gaze slid past her to Reed, and something ugly flickered in his expression. "Heard you bought yourself a Cowboy at auction. That true?" "I purchased a year's labor to help with the homestead," Nora corrected. "Everything legal and proper." "Sure it is," Blackwell said, his tone suggesting otherwise. "Listen, Miss Vaughn, I'll cut to the chase. This land borders mine, and I've been interested in acquiring it for a while. Your uncle wouldn't sell, but I'm hoping you'll be more reasonable. I'll give you a fair price, enough to set yourself up somewhere more suitable for a young woman alone." Nora felt anger rise hot in her throat. "This land isn't for sale, Mr. Blackwell. It's my home, and I intend to keep it." Blackwell's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. A woman alone can't hold a spread like this. You'll fail, and then you'll sell for whatever you can get, which will be a lot less than I'm offering now." "Then I'll fail on my own terms," Nora said flatly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." For a moment, she thought Blackwell might push the issue, might try to intimidate her through sheer presence. But Reed stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Nora and the mounted men, and something in his stance made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any threats. Blackwell noticed, and his lip curled. "Keep your dog on a leash, Miss Vaughn. Wouldn't want him to get hurt defending something that isn't worth defending." He wheeled his horse around, and his men followed suit. They thundered away, leaving dust hanging in the air. Nora let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You all right?" Reed asked quietly. "I'm fine," Nora said, but her hands were trembling. "That's not the first time someone's tried to pressure me into selling. Blackwell's made offers before, always with that same threatening undertone." Reed's jaw was tight with anger. He's the kind of man who thinks he can take whatever he wants. "You need to be careful around him, Miss Vaughn. Men like that don't take no for an answer." "I don't have a choice," Nora said. "This land is all I have. If I sell it, I'll have nothing. I'll be back to depending on other people's charity or working jobs that barely keep me fed. At least here I have a chance." Reed looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something complicated in his eyes, a mixture of admiration and concern, and something else she couldn't quite identify. "Then we'll make sure this place succeeds," he said finally. "We'll work it until it's so clearly thriving that even Blackwell will have to back off." The "we" in that statement made Nora's heart skip, but she reminded herself not to read too much into it. Reed was contracted to her for a year. Of course, he would speak in terms of "we" for that duration. It didn't mean anything beyond that. They worked even harder after Blackwell's visit, both of them driven by a determination to prove that the homestead could succeed. They harvested the late vegetables and stored them carefully for winter. Reed hunted, bringing back rabbits and prairie chickens that Nora preserved. They worked together to cut and stack firewood, preparing for the cold months ahead. As October arrived and the nights grew cooler, Nora realized that she looked forward to their evening conversations more than anything else in her day. Reed had started teaching her to shoot, using her uncle's old rifle, insisting that she needed to be able to defend herself and hunt if necessary. She proved to be a decent shot once she got over her nervousness about the rifle's kick. One evening, after a successful lesson where she had hit the target 3 times out of 5, they sat on the porch as the stars began to emerge. Reed was working on another carving, this one of what looked like a running wolf. "Can I ask you something personal, Mr. Donnelly?" Nora ventured. "You can ask," Reed said. "Can't promise I'll answer, but you can ask. Why did you gamble if you knew you couldn't afford to lose?" Reed was silent for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his carving and leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky. "I was drinking, which is no excuse, but it's the truth. I'd gotten news that my brother died. We weren't close, hadn't spoken in years, but it hit me harder than I expected. So I got drunk and stupid, and I gambled away money I didn't have. By the time I sobered up, I owed Hutchinson more than I could pay in 5 years of cowboy wages." "I'm sorry about your brother," Nora said softly. Reed nodded, his throat working. "He was younger than me, died in a mining accident out in Nevada. We'd had a falling out years back over something that seems stupid now. I kept meaning to reach out to make things right, but I told myself there was time, and then there wasn't." Nora understood that kind of regret, the weight of words left unspoken and chances missed. "Is that why you keep moving? To avoid getting attached to places or people?" "Maybe," Reed admitted. "Or maybe I just haven't found a place worth staying for yet." The words seemed to hang between them, full of possibility and danger. Nora wanted to ask if he thought this place, this homestead, might be worth staying for, if she might be worth staying for. But she kept silent, afraid of the answer either way. November brought the first hard freeze, and with it, the need to make sure everything was properly prepared for winter. They worked together to insulate the cabin better, stuffing cloth and moss into every gap they could find. Reed built a better chicken coop for the 3 hens Nora had acquired from a neighbor, and they made sure the barn was fully secure against the cold. The work brought them into close physical proximity, and Nora found herself increasingly aware of every accidental touch, every moment when Reed's hand would steady her elbow, or his shoulder would brush against hers. She thought she sometimes caught him looking at her with an expression that seemed like more than just professional interest. But she told herself she was imagining it, seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. One cold afternoon, they were working together to move sacks of grain into the barn when Nora's foot slipped on a patch of ice. She would have fallen hard if Reed hadn't caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her against his chest. For a moment they stood frozen, her hands clutching his shoulders, his arms tight around her. She could feel the solid warmth of him, smell the scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothes. "You all right?" Reed asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Nora managed, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must feel it. "Thank you." Reed released her slowly, his hands lingering at her waist for just a fraction longer than necessary. When Nora looked up at his face, she saw something raw and honest in his expression before he shuddered it away and stepped back. "Need to be more careful," he said gruffly. "Ice is dangerous." Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. They finished moving the grain in silence, but something had shifted between them, something that made the air feel charged and full of unspoken words. That night, Nora lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to talk sense into her foolish heart. She was falling in love with Reed Donnelly, had probably been falling in love with him since the day she bought his contract, and it was the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. He had made it clear he would be leaving when his year was up. She couldn't afford to give her heart to a man who was determined not to keep it. But hearts, she was learning, didn't much care about what was sensible or safe. December arrived with bitter cold and occasional snow. The homestead was as prepared as they could make it, with stores of food and firewood sufficient to last through the winter. The work became less urgent, more about maintenance and daily chores rather than the desperate scramble to get everything done before the weather turned. This meant more time spent in conversation, and Nora found herself learning things about Reed that made her affection deepen into something more profound. She learned that he could read and write well, unusual for a cowboy, because his mother had been a schoolteacher before she married. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise and made her laugh. She learned that he was unfailingly kind to animals and had a patience with difficult tasks that she envied. She also began to notice changes in how Reed treated her. He had always been respectful, but now there was a gentleness to his interactions that felt different. He would bring her coffee in the morning before she asked for it. He carved her a beautiful set of wooden spoons to replace her worn ones. He taught her to play chess using a set he carved himself, pieces representing cowboys and cattle barons instead of traditional kings and queens. On Christmas Eve, Nora used some of her precious stores of sugar and flour to make a dried apple pie, a luxury she wouldn't normally have allowed herself. When she presented it after their simple dinner, Reed looked at it with an expression of such genuine surprise and pleasure that she felt warmth bloom in her chest. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I wanted to," Nora replied. "It's Christmas, and you've worked hard. You deserve something special." They ate the pie slowly, savoring each bite. Then Reed disappeared into the barn and returned with something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Nora with an almost shy expression. Inside the cloth was a carved wooden box, every surface decorated with intricate patterns of flowers and vines. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the wood polished to a soft gleam. "Reed," Nora breathed, running her fingers over the carving. "This is beautiful. You made this." "Been working on it in the evenings," Reed said. "Thought you could use it for keeping things safe." Nora felt tears prick her eyes. No one had given her anything so thoughtful in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure it." Their eyes met, and the moment stretched between them, full of things neither of them seemed ready to say. Finally, Reed cleared his throat and looked away. "Should probably get to bed," he said. "Early start tomorrow." Nora nodded, clutching the box to her chest as Reed left for the barn. She set the box carefully on the shelf by her bed and ran her fingers over it one more time before blowing out the lamp. In the darkness, she let herself imagine what it might be like if Reed stayed beyond his contracted year. If he stayed because he wanted to, because he had found something worth staying for. But imagining was dangerous, and she forced herself to push the thoughts away. January and February passed in a blur of cold and monotonous routine. They were confined mostly to the immediate area around the cabin and barn, venturing out only when necessary. The enforced proximity should have made things awkward, but instead, Nora found it comfortable, almost domestic. They developed an easy rhythm, working together on small projects and spending evenings by the fire, reading from her uncle's small collection of books or playing chess. It was during these long winter evenings that Nora began to realize Reed was struggling with something. She would catch him staring into the fire with a troubled expression, or would notice how he seemed to choose his words carefully around her, as though constantly editing himself. One evening in late February, with the wind howling outside and snow falling steadily, Reed suddenly set down the piece of wood he had been carving and looked at her directly. "Miss Vaughn, I need to talk to you about something." Nora's heart sank. He was going to tell her he was leaving early, she was sure of it. That he couldn't stand another moment of this isolation, or that he had found the contract too constraining. "All right," she said, setting aside her mending. Reed ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of agitation. "My contract is up at the end of July. That's 5 months from now." "I'm aware," Nora said carefully. "When I agreed to this, when you bought my contract, I was planning to move on the moment it was up." "That was always my intention." Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. Here it came, the confirmation that he would be leaving, that all her foolish hopes were just that. "But things have changed," Reed continued, his dark eyes intense on hers. I've changed being here. Working this land with you, building something instead of just drifting from job to job. I've started to think about what it might be like to stay in one place, to build a real life instead of just surviving day to day. Nora's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. What are you saying? Reed leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I'm saying that I don't want to leave when the contract is up. I'm saying that I'd like to stay on here if you'll have me, not as hired help, but as a partner. I've got some money saved from before the gambling debt, not much but enough to contribute. We could expand the operation, maybe get some cattle, build this place into something really successful. It was everything Nora wanted to hear, and yet somehow not quite enough. She wanted him to stay, desperately, but the idea of him staying as just a business partner made her chest ache. As partners, she repeated. Yes, Reed said, and then hesitated. Unless you'd consider something more than that. The world seemed to stop. Nora stared at him, afraid to believe what she thought she was hearing. Something more. Reed stood up abruptly and crossed to the window, staring out at the snow-covered darkness. I'm not good with words, Miss Vaughn, never have been, but I need to be honest with you. These past months, working beside you, watching you fight for this place with everything you have, I've come to care for you. More than care, if I'm being truthful. I'm in love with you. The words hung in the air, stark and beautiful and terrifying. Nora stood up on shaking legs, her mending falling unheeded to the floor. Reed! He turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm a drifter with a gambling problem and a temper I don't always control. I've got nothing to offer you except my labor and my heart, and God knows that's not much. But if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of you. I'll work this land until my hands bleed. I'll build you the finest home in the Panhandle. I'll give you everything I have and everything I am. Nora crossed the small room until she stood directly in front of him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I bought your contract for $12, she said softly, and I got a lifetime. She saw understanding dawn in his eyes, saw hope and joy and love all mixed together. Nora, he said, her given name on his lips for the first time, and then his hands were cupping her face, and he was kissing her with a desperate tenderness that made her knees weak. Nora had been kissed before, awkward stolen kisses from boys in Kansas City, but nothing had prepared her for this. This kiss was like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. It was Reed's calloused hands gentle on her skin, his mouth moving against hers with a hunger tempered by reverence. It was her own hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer, trying to eliminate every inch of space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Reed rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said again, as though he needed to make sure she had heard him. I think I started loving you the moment you bid on me, when you looked at that auctioneer like you wanted to punch him for treating people like property. Nora laughed, a sound that was half joy and half tears. I love you too. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself because I thought you'd leave. But I couldn't help it. You became the best part of my every day. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, while outside the wind howled and the snow fell. Nora felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. She had spent so long being alone, fighting for every scrap of security, afraid to trust or hope. But here, in Reed's arms, she felt safe in a way that had nothing to do with physical protection and everything to do with being known and loved exactly as she was. We should probably talk about practical matters, Reed said eventually, though he made no move to release her. About how we want to do this. I meant what I said about being partners, This is your land, your homestead. I don't want to come in and take over. We build this together as equals or not at all." Nora pulled back enough to look at him properly. "Together," she said firmly. "But Reed, I need you to know that I don't need you to be perfect. You mentioned your temper and the gambling. Everyone has flaws. I need you to be honest with me always and to work with me when things are hard. That's all I ask." Reed nodded seriously. "I can do that. And Nora, I need the same from you. Don't try to shoulder everything alone because you're afraid of being a burden. We're a team now. Your problems are my problems and we solve them together." "Together," Nora agreed and kissed him again to seal the promise. They sat up late into the night, making plans and dreaming out loud about the future. Reed talked about his ideas for expanding the homestead, about crossbreeding cattle and improving the irrigation. Nora talked about her desire to eventually have a larger garden, maybe even sell produce in town. They discussed everything from the mundane to the magnificent, their words weaving together a vision of a shared life. "When should we get married?" Reed asked at one point, saying the word with a kind of wonder as though he couldn't quite believe it was real. Nora thought about it. "Spring. That gives us time to make sure we're truly certain, and it gives us something to look forward to through the last of winter." "I'm already certain," Reed said, "but spring sounds right, new beginnings and all that." They decided on April, which would give them time to ride into Dalhart and arrange for a proper ceremony. It would be small, just a justice of the peace and perhaps a few witnesses, but it would be legal and binding and real. The next months passed in a haze of happiness that Nora had never experienced before. Winter gradually gave way to the first hints of spring, and with the warming weather came a renewal of intense work on the homestead. But now every task felt different because they were building toward a shared future. Reed no longer slept in the barn but in the cabin, though he insisted on maintaining propriety and sleeping on the floor near the fire until they were married. They made a trip to Dalhart in late March to arrange for the wedding and to purchase supplies. While there, they ran into Henry Blackwell again. The rancher's eyes narrowed when he saw them together, clearly noting the new intimacy between them. "So the hired hand is moving up in the world," Blackwell said snidely. "Clever way to get your hands on land, Donnelly." Reed's jaw tightened, but Nora spoke before he could respond. "Mr. Donnelly and I are getting married because we love each other. The land has nothing to do with it. And even if it did, it's none of your business." Blackwell's expression turned ugly. "You're making a mistake, Miss Vaughn. This drifter will take everything you have and move on just like his kind always do. When he does, don't come crying to me for help." "I won't need to," Nora said coldly. "Because Reed isn't going anywhere and neither am I. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have business to attend to." She linked her arm through Reed's and walked away, her head held high. She could feel Reed trembling slightly with suppressed anger. "I wanted to hit him," Reed admitted once they were out of earshot. "I know," Nora said, "but that's what he wanted. He's trying to provoke you into doing something that would give him an excuse to cause trouble. We can't give him that satisfaction." Reed took a deep breath, visibly calming himself. "You're right. But Nora, I need you to know that what he said about me taking advantage of you, it's not true." "I would never—" "I know," Nora interrupted gently. "Reed, I know. Don't let him get in your head. We know the truth of what we have, and that's all that matters." They completed their business in town, arranging for a ceremony on April 15th with the justice of the peace, and purchasing a few supplies including fabric for Nora to make herself a new dress for the wedding. The ride back to the homestead was pleasant, full of easy conversation and comfortable silences. April arrived with wildflowers dotting the prairie and the promise of new growth everywhere. Nora worked on her dress in the evenings, a simple design in deep blue that Reed said brought out her eyes. Reed worked on fixing up the cabin even more, determined to make it as nice as possible for their married life. One evening, a week before the wedding, Nora brought up something that had been on her mind. "Reed, we should talk about children." Reed looked up from the harness he was mending. "All right. Do you want them?" Nora asked. "Children, I mean, because I do eventually, but I need to know if you're comfortable with that idea." Reed was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I do want children. I think you'd be an amazing mother. But Nora, I want to make sure we're stable first. I want to build this place up so that we can support a family properly, so that our children will have security and opportunity." Nora felt warmth spread through her chest at the way he said, "our children," with such casual certainty. "That makes sense. I'm not in any rush, I just needed to know we were on the same page." "We are," Reed assured her, reaching out to take her hand. "About this and about everything else that matters." The day of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, the sky a brilliant blue and the air full of the scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. They rode into Dalhart together, Nora in her new blue dress and Reed in his best clothes, which he had carefully cleaned and pressed for the occasion. The ceremony was simple and brief, conducted in the justice of the peace's office with his wife and clerk as witnesses. But when Reed slid the simple gold band he had purchased onto Nora's finger and spoke his vows, his voice was full of so much love and conviction that Nora felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I, Reed Donnelly, take you, Nora Vaughn, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, stand beside you in good times and bad, and build a life with you that's worth the price you paid. You gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one, and I'll spend every day of my life making sure you never regret it." Nora's own vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "I, Nora Vaughn, take you, Reed Donnelly, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, trust you, work beside you, and build something beautiful together. You've given me partnership when I thought I had to face everything alone, and I'll treasure that gift every day of my life." When the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, Reed kissed her with such tenderness that Nora forgot they had an audience. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling so hard their faces hurt. They celebrated with a meal at the hotel dining room, a luxury they could barely afford, but that felt appropriate for the occasion. Then they rode back to the homestead as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle explorations. Reed was patient and careful, making sure Nora felt safe and cherished. When they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Two people who had found each other against all odds and were determined to build a life together. Afterward, lying in Reed's arms in the darkness, Nora felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened her. She had never imagined she could have this, could have love and partnership and a future full of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Reed asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "About how much my life has changed in less than a year," Nora said. "Last August I was alone and scared and convinced I'd have to do everything myself. Now I'm married to the best man I've ever known, and we're building something real together." Reed tightened his arms around her. "I'm the lucky one. You saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. You gave me a reason to stop running and start building. I love you, Nora Donnelly." Nora smiled at her new name. "I love you too, Reed Donnelly." The months that followed were some of the happiest of Nora's life. She and Reed worked side by side through the spring and into summer, planting crops and making improvements to the property. They purchased a small herd of cattle with Reed's savings and Nora's careful management of their limited resources, and Reed proved to be as skilled with cattle as he had claimed. The homestead began to truly thrive. The crops came in strong, the cattle flourished on the prairie grass, and by summer's end they had saved enough to make plans for expanding the cabin. They talked about adding a second room, eventually building a proper house when they could afford it. In July, they celebrated the one-year anniversary of when Nora had purchased Reed's contract at auction. They marked the occasion by burning the contract itself in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken as the legal obligation turned to ash. "You're free," Nora said softly as the last of the contract disintegrated. Reed pulled her close. "I was free the moment I realized I was in love with you, because I wasn't staying out of obligation anymore. I was staying because I'd found home. Life wasn't without its challenges." There were hard days when the work seemed endless and the weather was brutal. There were moments of disagreement when they had to learn how to compromise and communicate. Henry Blackwell remained a persistent problem, occasionally making offers to buy the land or spreading rumors in town about Reed's past. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. When a summer storm damaged part of their new fence, they repaired it side by side. When Nora came down with a fever, Reed nursed her with a tenderness that made her love him even more. When Reed struggled with the anniversary of his brother's death, Nora held him and let him grieve without judgment. In September, Nora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be certain before telling Reed. When she finally shared the news one evening over dinner, his face went through a series of expressions so rapidly she couldn't track them all. Surprise, joy, fear, wonder, and finally settling on pure happiness. "A baby," he said, his voice full of awe. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Nora asked, even though she could see the answer on his face. Reed came around the table and pulled her to her feet, wrapping her in a careful embrace. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it." "Terrified too, but mostly happy." "God, Nora, we're going to be parents." They spent the evening making plans, talking about all the things they would need to do to prepare. Reed became even more determined to expand the cabin, insisting that they needed a proper nursery before the baby arrived. Nora, practical as always, focused on gathering supplies and making sure they had everything necessary for a birth. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Nora found the work harder as she grew larger. Reed took over more of the physical labor, insisting that she focus on lighter tasks. He was protective to the point of being overbearing, but Nora found it endearing rather than annoying. It was clear that he was terrified something might go wrong, that he might lose her or the baby. "I won't break," she told him one day when he tried to prevent her from lifting a water bucket. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm strong, Reed. Trust me to know my limits." Reed relaxed slightly. "I do trust you. I'm just scared. You and this baby are everything to me. The thought of something happening to either of you makes me feel like I can't breathe." Nora softened, touching his face gently. "I'm scared too, but we'll face it together, just like everything else. And Reed, even if something does go wrong, that's not something you can prevent by wrapping me in cotton wool. We just have to have faith that everything will be all right." Winter arrived, and with it the quiet, anxious waiting for the baby to come. Nora had calculated that the baby would arrive sometime in March, and as that month approached, Reed became increasingly nervous. He made sure they had a midwife lined up in town, a capable woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered dozens of babies. On a cold March night with frost sparkling on the ground outside, Nora's labor began. Reed rode like fury to fetch Mrs. Patterson while Nora did her best to stay calm and breathe through the contractions. By the time Reed returned with the midwife, the labor was progressing quickly. Reed wanted to stay with her, but Mrs. Patterson was old-fashioned and shooed him out of the bedroom. Nora could hear him pacing in the other room, his footsteps marking an anxious rhythm. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Nora feared she wouldn't survive it. But Mrs. Patterson was skilled and experienced, and just after dawn, the baby finally arrived. The sound of the baby's first cry made Nora sob with relief and joy. Mrs. Patterson cleaned the infant and wrapped it in a soft blanket, then placed the bundle in Nora's arms. "You have a son," the midwife announced with a smile. "A big, healthy boy." Nora stared down at her son in wonder, taking in his tiny, perfect features, his dark hair that looked like it might curl just like Reed's, his little fists waving in the air. She heard the door slam open and looked up to see Reed standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Nora," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm all right," Nora assured him. "We're both all right. Come meet your son." Reed crossed the room on shaking legs and sank down on the edge of the bed, staring at the baby with an expression of such profound emotion that Nora felt tears well up again. "He's perfect," Reed whispered. "He's so small and perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Nora asked. Reed looked terrified at the prospect but nodded. Nora carefully transferred their son to Reed's arms, showing him how to support the baby's head. Reed held the infant like he was made of glass, his large calloused hands so gentle. "Hello, little one," Reed said softly. "I'm your father, and I promise you I'm going to do everything in my power to give you a good life. You're going to grow up knowing you're loved and wanted and valued. You're going to have opportunities I never had. And you're going to know your mother is the bravest, strongest, most amazing woman in the world." Nora felt her heart overflow with love for both of them, her husband and her son. This was everything she had never dared to dream of having. They named him Samuel, after Nora's uncle, with the middle name of James after Reed's late brother. Samuel Reed Donnelly. It was a strong name, a good name, and as Nora watched Reed hold their son, she felt like everything in her life had led to this moment. The first few months with a newborn were exhausting but wonderful. Samuel was a relatively easy baby, though he had powerful lungs when he wanted something. Reed proved to be a devoted father, getting up in the night to bring Samuel to Nora for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just holding his son and talking to him in a soft voice. The homestead work didn't stop just because they had a baby, but they managed by working in shifts and being creative about when and how they accomplished tasks. Nora would strap Samuel to her chest in a sling while doing lighter work, and Reed would take the baby when Nora needed to focus on something that required both hands. One afternoon in late May, Nora was working in the garden with Samuel sleeping in a basket in the shade when she saw riders approaching. Her heart sank when she recognized Henry Blackwell at the head of the group. She called for Reed, who emerged from the barn with a wrench in his hand, his expression hardening when he saw who had arrived. Blackwell dismounted, his eyes going to the baby in the basket. "Heard you'd had a child. Congratulations." "Thank you," Nora said coolly. "What do you want, Mr. Blackwell?" Blackwell's expression turned serious. "I'm here to make one final offer for your land, Mrs. Donnelly, and I want you to hear me out before you refuse." Reed moved to stand beside Nora, his presence a solid support. "We're listening." Blackwell gestured to the homestead. "You've done well here, I'll grant you that. Better than I expected. But raising a child out here so far from town, from a doctor, from help if you need it, that's going to be hard. I'm offering you enough money to buy a nice house in town, with plenty left over to start a business or live comfortably for years. Your son would grow up with other children, would have access to school, would have opportunities he won't have out here. It was, Nora had to admit, a compelling argument. She had already worried about the isolation, about what would happen if Samuel got sick and they couldn't get to a doctor in time. But when she looked around at the homestead, at the land she and Reed had worked so hard to build into something thriving, she couldn't imagine giving it up. "It's a generous offer," Reed said carefully, "but this is Nora's land. The decision is hers to make." Blackwell's eyes sharpened with interest at that statement, and Nora knew he was mentally cataloging the information that Reed didn't claim ownership. She appreciated Reed's words, appreciated that he was making it clear this was her choice, but she also knew what her answer would be. "No," Nora said firmly. "Mr. Blackwell, I appreciate your concern for my son's welfare, but this land is our future. This is where Samuel will learn the value of hard work and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Yes, it will be hard sometimes, but that's true anywhere." "We're not selling." Blackwell's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake. That baby changes everything. You can't afford to be stubborn anymore." "It's not stubbornness," Nora said. "It's knowing what's right for our family. Now please leave our property." For a moment, Blackwell looked like he might argue further, but something in Reed's stance made him reconsider. He mounted his horse with jerky movements. "Fine. But when you're struggling to feed that baby, when winter comes and you're isolated out here, don't say I didn't warn you." He rode off, his men following. Once they were gone, Nora let out a shaky breath. Reed put his arm around her shoulders. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. He wasn't entirely wrong about the challenges. "I'm sure," Nora said. "This is our home, Reed. This is where we belong. We'll figure out the challenges, just like we always have." Reed kissed her temple. "Together." "Together," Nora agreed. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple happiness. Samuel grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's determination. The homestead continued to prosper, and by the time Samuel was 3, they had saved enough to build a proper house. A real home with multiple rooms and a porch where they could sit in the evenings. Nora became pregnant again when Samuel was 4, and this time the pregnancy felt easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1888, a daughter they named Catherine Rose. She had Nora's lighter hair and Reed's dark eyes, and from the moment of her birth, she had Samuel wrapped around her tiny finger. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children grew healthy and strong. The homestead expanded to include more cattle, and even a few horses that Reed trained and sold for extra income. They hired occasional help during busy seasons, young men looking for work, who Reed treated with the same respect he would have wanted when he was in their position. Samuel started learning to read and write from Nora, and Reed taught him to ride and rope and all the skills of ranch life. Catherine toddled after her brother, determined to do everything he could do despite being smaller. Watching Reed with their children, so patient and loving, Nora sometimes thought back to that August day when she had bid $12 for a desperate man's contract, and she marveled at how much had changed. One evening when Samuel was 8 and Catherine was 4, they were all sitting on the porch after dinner. Samuel was practicing his letters, Catherine was playing with the wooden horse Reed had carved for her, and Reed and Nora sat together on the bench Reed had built, his arm around her shoulders. "Papa," Samuel said suddenly, "how did you and Mama meet?" Reed and Nora exchanged glances. They had never told the children the full story, had skirted around the details whenever questions came up. But Samuel was getting older, and Nora thought perhaps it was time for honesty. "Your father was in some trouble," Nora began carefully. He owed money he couldn't pay, and the man he owed it to decided to auction off your father's labor for a year to settle the debt. Samuel's eyes went wide. They sold Papa, in a manner of speaking, Reed said. It was wrong, and I'm not proud of the circumstances that led to it, but it happened, and your mother was at that auction. I had $12, Nora continued. It was all the money I had in the world. I should have used it to buy things I needed for the homestead. But I looked at your father standing up there and I couldn't stand it, so I bid those $12 and I won. You bought Papa for $12, Catherine asked, looking up from her toy. I bought his contract, Nora corrected gently. Not him. People can't really be bought or sold, even though sometimes it seems like they can be. But yes, $12 bought me a year of your father's help on the homestead. And then you fell in love, Samuel said with the certainty of a child who had heard enough fairy tales to know how stories should go. Reed smiled. And then we fell in love. Your mother saved me in more ways than one that day. She gave me a chance to be better than I had been, and she gave me a reason to want to be better. And now we have all this. He gestured to the homestead, to the house, to the children. We have a life I never thought I'd be lucky enough to have. Was it worth it, Mama? Catherine asked. Spending all your money? Nora looked at Reed, at the life they had built together, at their beautiful children, at the home they had created through love and hard work. It was the best investment I ever made, she said. I paid $12 and got a lifetime. Reed pulled her closer and kissed her forehead. We both did. The children seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to their activities. Nora leaned against Reed, watching the sun set over their land, and felt a deep sense of peace. Life wasn't always easy. They still faced challenges, still had hard days, still worried about the future. But they faced it all together, and that made everything bearable. Henry Blackwell had eventually given up on trying to buy their land, especially after a drought hit his own spread hard and forced him to sell off portions of it. The Donnelly homestead, with its good well and careful management, had weathered the drought better than most. They had even been able to help some neighbors, sharing water and resources, building goodwill in the community. As the years continued to pass, the Donnelly family became a fixture in the area. Samuel grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch life, and Catherine proved to have her mother's head for business and her father's way with animals. Nora and Reed added 2 more children to their family, twin boys born in 1892, who were handfuls from the moment they could crawl. Through it all, the love between Nora and Reed only deepened. They had grown together, learned together, built something extraordinary together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they took a rare evening to themselves, sitting on the porch of the house they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked, leaning against Reed's shoulder. "Staying when your contract was up. Sometimes I wonder if you ever wish you had kept drifting, kept your freedom." Reed was quiet for a moment, then turned to look at her. Even after 20 years, his gaze still had the power to make her heart skip. "Nora, the day you bid on me at that auction, I thought my life was over. I thought I had hit rock bottom and there was nowhere to go but further down. But you saw something in me worth saving. You gave me honest work and honest treatment. You gave me respect when I didn't deserve it, and somewhere along the way you gave me your heart." He took her hand, his thumb running over the gold band that had worn thin over the years. "I've never regretted staying. Not once. This life, this family, it's everything I never knew I wanted. You're right that you paid $12 and got a lifetime, but you need to understand that I got the better end of that deal. I got you." Nora felt tears prick her eyes, even after all these years, still moved by Reed's words. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Reed replied. More than I did yesterday, less than I will tomorrow. They sat together as the stars came out, watching the land they had built together, the home they had created. In the house behind them, they could hear their children's voices, arguing and laughing in equal measure. It was the sound of family, of life, of everything that mattered. Nora thought back to that frightened, desperate young woman who had stood in the Dalhart town square with $12 in her hand, watching a proud man being auctioned off like property. She thought about the courage it had taken to bid, about the leap of faith required to bring a stranger to her isolated homestead. She thought about all the moments of doubt, all the fears, all the challenges they had faced, and she thought about how every single bit of it had been worth it. Because that $12, that act of defiance and compassion and desperate hope, had bought her more than a year's labor. It had bought her a partner, a lover, a best friend. It had bought her a family and a future. It had bought her a lifetime of love. Reed pulled her closer and Nora smiled into the darkness. Their story had started with an auction and a contract, with desperation and debt. But it had transformed into something beautiful, something lasting, something real. She had paid $12 and gotten a lifetime. But really, they had both won something far more valuable than money could ever buy. They had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found home. The years continued to roll by, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Samuel eventually married a schoolteacher named Mary who had come to Dalhart to teach, and they built a house on the far edge of the Donnelly property, expanding the family operation. Catherine showed no interest in marriage, instead throwing herself into running the ranch alongside her father and proving herself just as capable as any man. The twins, Daniel and David, were inseparable troublemakers who kept Nora on her toes but who had good hearts underneath all the mischief. They took to ranching like they were born to it, and by their teenage years, they were handling cattle drives and horse breaking with confidence. Reed's hair started to gray at the temples, and Nora found lines on her face that hadn't been there before. But they wore their age well, still strong and capable from years of physical work. They had built something that would outlast them, had created a legacy for their children and their children's children. On a warm day in June of 1902, exactly 20 years after that fateful auction, Nora stood in the garden she still tended, now with the help of her grandchildren. Samuel and Mary had blessed them with 3 grandchildren so far, and Catherine had taken in an orphaned boy from town who needed a home and a family. Reed came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Look at all this," he said softly. "Look at what we built." Nora leaned back against him, surveying the homestead with pride. The original cabin still stood, used now as a storage shed. The house they had built had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. The barn was sturdy and well-maintained. The cattle grazed contentedly in the pastures. The garden flourished. Children's laughter rang out across the yard. "We built a good life," Nora agreed. "The best life," Reed corrected. "And it all started with $12 and a woman brave enough to take a chance on a broken-down cowboy." Nora turned in his arms to face him. "You were never broken. You were just waiting for the right reason to stop running." Reed kissed her, slow and sweet, the kiss of 2 people who had loved each other through 2 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "I'd do it all again," Nora said. "Every bit of it exactly the same. Even the hard parts," Reed asked. "Especially the hard parts," Nora confirmed. "Because they made us who we are, they taught us what we're capable of. And they made the good parts that much sweeter." Reed nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. They stood there together in the garden, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, and Nora felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She had been so young when she had placed that bid, so uncertain and afraid. She couldn't have imagined then what that decision would bring her. But standing here now, with Reed's arms around her and their family thriving around them, she knew with absolute certainty that it had been the right choice. The only choice. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a chance on someone, have faith in the possibility of something better, and be willing to work for it. She had paid $12 for a Cowboy's contract at an auction in Dalhart, Texas, on a hot August day in 1882. And she had gotten a lifetime of love, partnership, family, and joy in return. It was, without question, the best investment she had ever made. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, their children and grandchildren gathered on the porch for the evening meal. It was a tradition they maintained, everyone coming together to share food and conversation at the end of the day. Reed and Nora joined them, taking their places at the head of the long table Reed had built years ago. Looking around at the faces of the people she loved, at the legacy she and Reed had created together, Nora felt her heart full to bursting. This was what mattered. Not money or status or security, though they had worked hard for all of those things. What mattered was love, family, partnership, and the willingness to build something lasting together. That night, lying in bed with Reed's arms around her just as they had been for 20 years, Nora thought about the journey they had taken together. From that auction block to this moment, from strangers bound by contract to soulmates bound by love, they had traveled a long road. It hadn't always been easy, but it had always been worth it. "Reed," she whispered into the darkness. He murmured, already half asleep. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for building this life with me." Reed tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Thank you for taking a chance. Thank you for giving me a home." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, their hearts beating in sync. Outside, the Texas night was full of stars, and the land they had worked so hard to build stretched out around them, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they faced life together. The story of the cowboy who was auctioned off to the highest bidding woman, of the woman who paid $12 and got a lifetime, became a legend in their family. Their grandchildren would tell it to their own children, and those children to their children in turn. It became a story about courage and faith, about seeing value where others saw only debt, about the power of love to transform lives. But for Nora and Reed, it was simply their truth, the foundation of everything they had built together. A reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards. They lived long lives together, growing old side by side on the land they loved. When Reed passed away at the age of 78, Nora grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been granted more than 50 years together, years full of love and laughter and purpose. She followed him 2 years later, and they were buried side by side in the family cemetery on the ranch, under the big Texas sky they had both loved. Their descendants continued to work the land, expanding and building on the foundation Nora and Reed had laid. The Donnelly Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the Texas Panhandle, but more importantly, it remained a family operation, a place where love and hard work were valued equally. And always, hanging in a place of honor in the main house, was a small carved wooden box, intricately decorated with flowers and vines. Inside it was a single gold coin, a reminder of the $12 that had started it all. Below it, a small plaque read, "She paid $12 and got a lifetime." It was a legacy of love, of courage, of two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful together. It was proof that sometimes the best investments aren't measured in money, but in faith, in compassion, in the willingness to see potential where others see only problems. It was the story of Nora and Reed Donnelly, who had started as stranger and contractor, become partners and lovers, and ultimately created a family and a legacy that would endure for generations. All because one woman had the courage to place a bid, and one man had the wisdom to stay when he found something worth staying for. In the end, they had both won. They had both found home, and that was worth more than all the money in the world.